Welcome back to Stories of Hammer. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and counterintuitive phenomena in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. We're exploring a question that seems to defy everything we know about orc psychology, a mystery that has played out on battlefields across the galaxy for 10,000 years. We're asking why the most combat-obsessed species in the universe, the greenskins who live and breathe for the thrill of battle, who measure their worth in the enemies they've crushed, systematically avoid engaging with one particular type of imperial war machine. We're examining why orcs, who will charge headlong into certain death against titans, who will gleefully throw themselves at fortified positions, who view retreat as merely a chance to come back for another go, will actively disengage when faced with the golden walking tombs known as Custodian Dreadnoughts. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. This is a pattern documented in countless after-action reports, a battlefield reality that has been observed by tactical officers across multiple segmentums, a phenomenon so consistent that even the most aggressive orc warbosses seem to instinctively understand it. When the golden form of a Custodian Dreadnought strides onto the field of battle, something fundamental changes in the behavior of orc forces. The Mabuegesh! Energy that normally drives them to ever greater acts of violence seems to falter. The mob mentality that makes them so terrifyingly effective begins to fracture. Warbosses who would gladly trade 1,000 boys for a single kill suddenly find better places for their forces to fight. To understand this phenomenon, we need to grasp just how unusual it is. Orcs are not a species given to tactical discretion. These are warriors who literally need combat like humans need food and water. Their entire physiology is geared toward war. Their society is structured around violence. Their gods, Gork and Mork, are deities of cunning brutality and brutal cunning. When an orc sees something big and dangerous, their first instinct isn't to run away, it's to figure out how to fight it, kill it, and take its teeth as trophies. They'll charge into the teeth of artillery fire, bellowing their war cry. They'll assault fortress walls with crude ladders, while defenders rain death upon them. They'll ram their space hulks into Imperial Navy vessels, without a second thought about the consequences. Yet when a Custodian Dreadnought appears, something different happens. The usual orc enthusiasm for a good scrap evaporates like morning mist under a harsh sun. Where there should be a surge of eager violence, there's instead a sudden recalculation of priorities. The orcs don't turn and flee in panic. Not exactly, that would be too simple. Instead, they find other objectives. They discover urgent business elsewhere on the battlefield. They remember important fights that need fighting over there. Anywhere but where the Golden Walker stalks through their lines. This behavior becomes even more remarkable when you consider what Custodian Dreadnoughts represent on the battlefield. These are not the most numerous of Imperial war machines. They're not deployed in massive formations like the Limon Rust tanks of the Astra Militarum. They don't fill the skies like the aircraft of the Imperial Navy. In terms of raw numbers, a warboss might see only 1 or 2 in an entire campaign, if that. Yet their impact on orc behavior is disproportionate to their presence. A single Custodian Dreadnought can cause an entire Mabuegesh to rout around it like water flowing around a stone, seeking easier paths to victory, softer targets to engage. Over the course of this exploration, we're going to examine every aspect of this phenomenon. We'll start by understanding exactly what the Adeptus Custodes are and why they occupy such a unique position in the Imperium's military hierarchy. We'll delve into the creation and capabilities of Custodian Dreadnoughts themselves, these walking tombs that house warriors who have served the Emperor for millennia. We'll explore orc psychology in depth, examining what drives these greenskins to fight and, critically, what makes them withdraw from combat. We'll look at historical encounters between these forces, analyzing the patterns that emerge from these clashes. We'll investigate the psychic dynamics at play, understanding how the WH40K field interacts with the Emperor's chosen warriors, and we'll examine the tactical reality of these engagements, the brutal mathematics that make fighting a Custodian Dreadnought a losing proposition for any orc force. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why this phenomenon exists, why it's actually a testament to Ork intelligence rather than cowardice, and what it tells us about both the Adeptus Custodes and the Greenskin Menace. You'll see how this seemingly small detail reveals profound truths about the nature of war in the 41st millennium, where even the most aggressive species in the galaxy has learned to recognize the difference between a good fight and a futile slaughter. The Emperor's chosen, understanding the Adeptus Custodes, before we can understand why Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts. We need to establish exactly what the Adeptus Custodes are, and why they represent something fundamentally different from every other military force in the Imperium. This isn't just about superior training or better equipment, though they possess both in abundance. This is about a level of martial excellence so profound that it transcends normal military classifications entirely. The Adeptus Custodes, also known as the Custodian Guard, or simply the 10,000, are the personal bodyguards of the Emperor of Mankind. They were created during the unification wars of ancient terror, before the Great Crusade, before the Space Marine Legions, before the Imperium itself existed in its current form. The Emperor declared them his personal protectors, warriors whose lives would be forfeit to guarantee his physical safety, whose loyalty would be absolute and unquestionable. This wasn't mere ceremony or political theater. This was the Emperor recognizing that he needed defenders worthy of standing at his side, warriors who could face any threat to his person and emerge victorious. The process of creating a custodian is fundamentally different from the creation of a space marine, and this difference is crucial to understanding their capabilities. Space marines are mass-produced warriors, if such a term can be applied to the Emperor's Angels of Death. The gene, seed implantation process is standardized, replicated across thousands of chapter fortresses throughout the galaxy. Each space marine receives the same 19 or 20 organs, the same genetic enhancements, the same basic transformation from human to Astartes. Certainly, there are variations between chapters, slight mutations in the gene, seed, but the fundamental template remains consistent. A space marine from the Ultramarines and a space marine from the Blood Angels undergo essentially the same transformation process. Custodians are not made this way. Each member of the Adeptus Custodes is individually crafted using cellular alchemy and genetic manipulation techniques that remain secret even within the Imperium's highest circles. The Emperor himself designed the process, drawing on ancient sciences from the dark age of technology and his own incomparable understanding of genetics and the human genome. Where a space marine is created through implantation of additional organs and gene, seed, a custodian is rebuilt from the genetic level up. Their very DNA is rewritten, restructured, optimized in ways that make each warrior a unique masterwork of biological engineering. No two custodians are precisely identical in their enhancements because each is tailored to the individual being transformed. This individual approach means that creating a custodian takes far longer than creating a space marine. Where a chapter can produce new Astartes in batches, the Adeptus Custodes must craft each warrior separately, a process that can take years or even decades. This is why their numbers have never exceeded 10,000, a figure that gave them their cognomen. The Emperor recognized that quality mattered more than quantity when it came to his personal defenders. Better to have 10,000 perfect warriors than a million merely excellent ones. The results of this approach are staggering. A custodian is to a space marine what a space marine is to a normal human. This isn't hyperbole or imperial propaganda. This is observable fact confirmed by countless battlefield encounters. In pure physical terms, custodians are faster, stronger, and more resilient than Astartes. Their reflexes operate at speeds that make even veteran space marines seem sluggish. Their strength allows them to wield weapons that would be unwieldy for standard Astartes. Their endurance lets them fight for extended periods without fatigue or diminished performance. But raw physical superiority is only part of the equation. Custodians are also intellectually enhanced far beyond the baseline for space marines. Each member of the 10,000 is a philosopher warrior, a scholar soldier who has studied warfare history, philosophy, and countless other disciplines for decades or even centuries. A Space Marine might be trained in squad tactics and battlefield strategy. A Custodian understands grand strategy, political theory, psychological warfare, and can switch seamlessly between these different modes of thinking depending on the tactical situation. They're trained to operate as individuals rather than as part of a unit, because each Custodian is expected to be a complete fighting force unto himself, capable of making independent tactical decisions without relying on the cohesion and coordination that Space Marines depend upon. Their equipment reflects their status as the Emperor's personal guard. Custodian armor isn't mass-produced in Forge, worlds like Space Marine power armor. Each suit is hand-crafted by the finest artificers of Mars and Terra, using auramite, a golden alloy whose exact composition remains a closely guarded secret. Auramite is stronger and lighter than the ceramite used in Space Marine armor, and it's often inscribed with protective wards and blessed by the highest-ranking members of the ecclesiarchy. Their weapons are similarly masterwork pieces, guardian spears and sentinel blades that incorporate both power weapon technology and integrated bolt weapons, allowing a Custodian to engage enemies at range and in melee with the same weapon. Perhaps most importantly, Custodians carry with them a spark of the Emperor's own divine essence. This isn't mysticism or religious fervor, though there's certainly an element of both in how the Imperium views the 10,000. This is a measurable psychic phenomenon. The Emperor's gene, craft, touched each Custodian, and that touch left something behind. A fragment of his protection that manifests as a supernatural warding against the powers of the warp. Psychic attacks that would overwhelm a Space Marine's mental defenses simply fail against Custodians. Demonic corruption that could turn an Astartes to chaos cannot take root in a Custodian's soul. This protection extends even to their presence on the battlefield, as if the Emperor's own light shines through them, driving back the darkness of the Imperium. Their combat record speaks for itself. During the Battle of Gyros, Thravian, 1,000 Custodians led by the Emperor slaughtered over 100,000 Orks while suffering only 3 casualties. 3 out of 1,000. Against an Ork horde that had already put 3 full Space Marine legions on the defensive. The Custodians didn't just win this battle. They dominated it so completely that the Emperor had the names of the 3 fallen warriors engraved into his personal armor, commemorating their sacrifice. This kill ratio, 1 Custodian for every 3,000 Orks, illustrates the gulf in capability between the Emperor's guardians and virtually any other fighting force in the galaxy. During the Horus Heresy, the Custodians fought at the walls of the Imperial Palace against the corrupted might of half the Space Marine legions. Chaos enhanced traitors who had become monsters far more dangerous than the Astartes who originally turned against the Emperor. The 10,000 held. They endured months of siege warfare against impossible odds, facing not just traitor Marines but daemons, possessed titans, and corrupted primarchs. They paid a terrible price in blood, but they held the line until the Emperor could confront Horus aboard his flagship, and they've never forgotten the cost of that defense. In the 41st millennium, the role of the Adeptus Custodes has evolved. For 10,000 years after the Emperor was entombed upon the Golden Throne, the 10,000 remained within the Imperial Palace, guarding their comatose master with unwavering vigilance. They became legends, figures of myth whispered about, but rarely seen. But with the opening of the Great Rift and the return of Robout Guilliman, the Custodians have once again begun deploying beyond Terra. Shield hosts now venture forth to combat the greatest threats to the Imperium, bringing the Emperor's wrath to those who would threaten his realm. When they deploy, entire campaigns can shift because of their presence. Enemies that seemed unstoppable falter before the Golden Warriors. Defensive lines that were crumbling suddenly hold. The mere fact of Custodian deployment can turn the tide of wars that have raged for years. This is the force that Custodian Dreadnoughts emerge from. These aren't Space Marine Dreadnoughts, already formidable war machines, enhanced with the same individual craftsmanship and martial excellence that characterizes the 10,000. These are the walking embodiments of the Emperor's will, piloted by warriors who were already far beyond the capabilities of normal Astartes before they were entombed, and who have continued to serve and fight for centuries, or even millennia within their armored sarcophagi. Understanding this context is essential to grasping why Orks, who will fight virtually anything else in the galaxy, choose to avoid these particular war machines. The Adeptus Custodes aren't just elite soldiers. They're something fundamentally other, warriors who exist on a different tier of capability entirely. And when those warriors are preserved within the walking fortresses of dreadnought armor, they become something that even the most combat-hungry Ork recognizes as a threat beyond the normal parameters of battle. Walking tomes of gold, Custodian Dreadnoughts explained. To truly understand why Orks avoid engaging with Custodian Dreadnoughts, we need to examine exactly what these war machines are, how they're created, and what capabilities they bring to the battlefield. These aren't simply custodians in bigger armor. They represent a fundamental transformation, a joining of the Emperor's finest warrior with some of the most advanced war machine technology ever created by human hands. The decision to enter a custodian within a dreadnought sarcophagus is never made lightly. For all their incredible durability and resilience, even custodians can suffer wounds so catastrophic that their bodies cannot recover. In such cases, when a warrior's physiology has been destroyed beyond the ability of even the Imperium's finest apothecaries to repair, but their mind remains intact and their will to serve burns undimmed, they're offered a choice that no custodian takes lightly. They can accept a peaceful death, their service to the Emperor concluded with honor, or they can undergo the rite of Sitish, the process of entombment within a dreadnought chassis. This is not the same choice offered to space marines who face similar injuries. For an Astartes, entombment in a dreadnought is often seen as a great honor, a chance to continue serving their chapter beyond the mortal span. For a custodian, it's more complex. The Adeptus Custodes view their service as a deeply personal bond with the Emperor, a relationship that exists between the individual warrior and their master. Entombment means giving up the form the Emperor crafted for them, trading flesh for metal, accepting a twilight existence within an armored tomb. Many custodians who receive mortal wounds choose to decline entombment, preferring to meet death with dignity, rather than endure what they see as a diminished existence. Those who do accept entombment undergo a process that's as painstaking and individualized as their original transformation into custodians. The tech, priests of Mars who perform the operation are among the highest-ranking members of the Mechanicus, specialists who have spent centuries mastering the arts required to successfully enter a custodian. The warrior's remains, often little more than a torso, head, and perhaps partial limbs, are carefully preserved within an amniotic tank filled with nutrient fluids and neural interface solutions. Their nervous system is painstakingly connected to the dreadnought's control systems through thousands of individual neural links, each one calibrated specifically to that warrior's unique physiology. The process can take months or even years to complete, and throughout it all, the custodian must remain conscious and cooperative, their iron will holding them together through procedures that would drive lesser beings mad. The dreadnought chassis itself is a masterwork of technology that far surpasses the standard patterns used for space marine dreadnoughts. These are Contemptor, pattern war machines, ancient designs that date back to the Great Crusade and before. The standard Contemptor is already superior to more modern dreadnought patterns like the Castroferum, featuring more sophisticated targeting systems, more powerful weapons, and superior mobility. Custodian Contemptors take this base design and enhance it with the same level of individual craftsmanship that goes into every piece of Custodian wargear. The armor is constructed from oromite, the same golden alloy used in Custodian battle plate, layered in sheets that can withstand punishment that would shred ceramite. The servos and actuators are precision, engineered to provide the same speed and agility that custodians possess in their flesh and blood forms, allowing these massive war machines to move with a grace that belays their size. The power plant is a miniaturized fusion reactor that provides nearly limitless energy, feeding both the chassis's movement systems and its devastating weapon systems. Every surface is inscribed with protective wards, blessed oils are applied in sacred rituals, and the machine's spirits that inhabit these ancient constructs are among the most powerful and aggressive in the Imperium's arsenals. There are several variants of Custodian Dreadnoughts, each designed for specific tactical roles. The venerable Contemptor Dreadnought is the most common pattern, if such a term can be applied to machines that number in the dozens rather than thousands. These war machines are armed with a combination of ranged and melee weapons, typically mounting either a melter or a Kara's pattern assault cannon on one arm, while the other terminates in a massive dreadnought close combat weapon, a power fist large enough to crush battle tanks and tear apart fortified positions. The melter fires superheated beams that can reduce armored vehicles to molten slag, while the assault cannon spits out a storm of reactive shells at a rate that can shred infantry formations in seconds. In close combat, the power fist delivers blows with enough force to demolish buildings, each strike backed by the dreadnought's immense strength and the pilot's centuries of martial expertise. The Contemptor, Achilles, represents a more assault-focused variant. This pattern is built around getting into close combat as quickly as possible and devastating the enemy in melee. One arm mounts a massive dread spear, a weapon that functions as both a power lance for devastating charge attacks and incorporates integrated bolt weapons for ranged engagement. The other arm carries either an Achilles Storm Bolter or another close combat weapon. The Achilles is faster than standard Contemptors. Its enhanced leg actuators, allowing it to charge across the battlefield with startling speed for something so large. When it hits enemy lines, the result is catastrophic. The Dread Spear can impale heavy tanks, the power field surrounding its blade allowing it to punch through armor that would stop conventional weapons cold. The Contemptor, Galatus, might be the most intimidating variant of all. This pattern is designed to anchor a defensive line, to stand immovable against any assault while dealing death to all who approach. It carries the Galatus Warblade, an enormous power weapon that's as tall as a space marine, along with a vastly enlarged Presidium shield. This shield isn't just armor, it incorporates the same refractor field technology used in standard Custodian shields, creating an energy barrier that can deflect even the heaviest weapons fire. Combined with the Dreadnought's already formidable armor, this makes the Galatus incredibly difficult to destroy. Meanwhile, the Warblade sweeps through enemy formations with contemptuous ease, each strike felling multiple foes. The Galatus also mounts twin, linked Infernus incinerators, flamer weapons built into the Warblade itself, allowing it to bathe the approaching enemies in Prometheum fire while simultaneously carving through them with the power blade. But the true strength of Custodian Dreadnoughts lies not in their hardware, impressive though it is, but in the warriors piloting them. These are Custodians who have served the Emperor for centuries, or even millennia. They fought in the Great Crusade, defending the Emperor as he conquered the galaxy. They stood watch during the Horus Heresy, holding the walls against traitors and daemons. They've endured 10,000 years of vigil, witnessing the slow decline of the Imperium while remaining perfect and incorruptible themselves. Their tactical acumen is beyond measure. Their understanding of warfare, refined over lifetimes that span ages. They've fought against every Xeno species known to the Imperium, faced every variant of traitor and heretic, and emerged victorious from battles that would fill volumes if they were all recorded. Sagittarius stands as perhaps the most famous of all Custodian Dreadnoughts. He was one of the first 30 Custodians ever created by the Emperor's own hand, serving alongside his master during the Unification Wars, when Terra was still a planet of warring factions. Choleric and wild even by Custodian standards. Sagittarius was the first of the 10,000 to suffer mortal wounds, and the first to be interred within a Contemptor sarcophagus. He went on to fight through the entire Great Crusade, his golden form a familiar sight in the vanguard of humanity's expansion across the stars. During the Horus Heresy, Sagittarius fought against the sons of Horus themselves, standing in the breach against traitors who had once been brothers. Whether he still serves in the 41st Millennium remains unknown, but his legend persists, a reminder of what Custodian Dreadnoughts represent. Histories serves as another example of these legendary warriors. Before his entombment, Calixor was a shield captain, one of the Custodian Guard's most accomplished leaders. He came to prominence during the defense of the Imperial Palace in the Horus Heresy, where he personally held a critical choke point against waves of traitor forces for 3 days straight, never yielding a single step despite suffering wounds that would have killed a dozen Space Marines. When those wounds finally forced him to accept entombment, he continued to serve with the same dedication, his tactical genius now expressed through the Contemptor's devastating weapon systems. For millennia afterward, Histories stood ready to defend terror against any threat, and when the Custodes finally began deploying beyond the throne world once more, his ancient war machine strode forth to bring the Emperor's judgment to the farthest reaches of the Imperium. When a Custodian Dreadnought enters battle, it doesn't simply walk onto the field. It strides forward with a terrible purpose, each step shaking the ground. Its weapon systems charging with a building whine that speaks of imminent destruction. The vox-amplified voice of the pilot booms across the battlefield, delivering pronouncements of doom to the Emperor's enemies in tones that carry millennia of authority. The golden armor gleams even through the smoke and chaos of combat, a beacon of the Emperor's light that draws the eye and captures the attention of every combatant nearby. The machine spirits of these ancient war machines are unlike those found in standard Imperial vehicles. They're aggressive, wrathful, and utterly loyal to the Emperor. Some priests theorize that these machine spirits are somehow touched by the same divine essence that affects living custodians, giving them a measure of protection against corruption and an almost supernatural ferocity in combat. Whether this is true or merely superstition, the effect is undeniable. Custodian Dreadnoughts seem to seek out the most dangerous enemies on the battlefield, as if their machine spirits hunger for worthy opponents to destroy. The weapons they carry speak death with every discharge. The Melter's superheated beam can reduce a lemon rust battle tank to molten slag in a single sustained burst. The assault cannon fires at such a rate that the stream of shells appears almost solid, a wall of explosive death that can shred entire squads in seconds. The Dreadspear punches through armor like tissue paper, impaling tanks and monsters with equal ease. The Galatus Warblade cleaves through fortified positions, each swing collapsing walls and crushing defenders, and in melee combat, the sheer physical power of these machines becomes apparent. They can tear gun emplacements from their foundations, crush tanks beneath their armored feet, and swing their weapons with enough force to send enemies flying dozens of meters through the air. This combination of factors, the ancient warriors piloting them, the masterwork construction of their chassis, the devastating weapons they carry, the aggressive machine spirits that animate them, and the aura of the Emperor's protection that surrounds them, makes Custodian Dreadnoughts among the most formidable individual combatants in the entire Imperium. They're force multipliers in the truest sense, single units that can change the outcome of entire engagements through their presence alone. And this is before we even consider how they affect the enemies they face, how their mere appearance on the battlefield can shatter morale and break the will to fight. Now, with this understanding of what Custodian Dreadnoughts are and what they can do, we can begin to examine why Orks, who face down Titans and greater daemons with enthusiasm, choose to avoid engaging with these particular war machines. The answer, as we'll see, lies in a complex interaction of psychology, physics, and the strange psychic dynamics that govern Ork behavior. The green tide, Ork psychology, and the power gauge! To understand why Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts, we must first understand what drives Orks to fight in the first place, and perhaps more importantly, what can make them withdraw from combat. The greenskin species is fundamentally different from humanity in ways that go far beyond their green skin and massive physiques. Their entire psychology, their society, and even their biology are oriented toward war, in ways that make them simultaneously one of the galaxy's greatest threats and one of its most predictable foes. Orks aren't born in the way humans understand birth. They're a fungoid species, spreading through spores that germinate in the soil and grow into new orks. This means that wherever orks go, more orks will follow, sprouting from the ground like particularly violent mushrooms. This reproductive method makes them almost impossible to permanently eradicate from a world, as spores can lie dormant for years, or even decades before conditions become right for germination. It also means that orks never know anything but war. They literally grow from the ground already knowing how to fight, their genetic memory containing millennia of combat experience encoded in their very DNA. This genetic encoding extends beyond basic combat skills. Orks are actually the degraded remnants of a far more sophisticated species called the Krork, warrior constructs created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven millions of years ago. The Krork were designed to be the perfect soldiers, capable of rapid reproduction, inherently resistant to chaos corruption, and possessed of an instinctive understanding of warfare and technology. Over the eons, the Krork degraded into modern orks, losing much of their intelligence and sophistication, but retaining the core traits that made them such effective warriors. This ancient heritage explains many otherwise inexplicable aspects of ork behavior and abilities. The most important of these inherited traits is the Gestalt psychic field known as the WH. This field, powered by the collective psychic emanations of nearby orks, serves multiple crucial functions in greenskin society. First and foremost, it allows orks to instinctively recognize who is the biggest and strongest among them, establishing the pecking order that forms the basis of all ork social structures. Might makes right in ork society. And the WH field ensures that every ork can sense who's in charge without needing complex chains of command or written orders. The boss is the boss because he's the biggest, and every ork knows this immediately through the psychic pressure he exerts on those around him. Field also seems to have a reality warping effect that allows ork technology to function despite being, by all logical standards, completely non-functional. Ork weapons are cobbled together from scrap metal, held together with wire and hope, and should by all rights explode in their users' faces or simply fail to fire. But because the orks believe these weapons will work, because the WH field subtly influences reality to match ork expectations, they do work. Red vehicles go faster because orks believe red is the fast color. Explosives become more powerful when painted yellow. Weapons fire straighter when they're pointed at something the ork really wants to kill. This isn't magic precisely, but it's a form of mass psychic manipulation of reality that the Mechanicus has observed but never fully understood. Most importantly for our purposes, the WH field feeds on violence and grows stronger with combat. When orks fight, when they experience the thrill of battle and the joy of crushing enemies, they generate powerful psychic emissions that feed back into the WH field, making it stronger, which in turn makes the orks more confident and aggressive, which leads to more fighting. It's a feedback loop that can rapidly spiral into the massive military campaigns that the Imperium also calls WHs, where millions of orks swarm across star systems in an unstoppable tide of green fury. This understanding of the WH field is crucial because it explains what orks need from combat. They're not fighting for resources, though they'll certainly loot anything they can get their hands on. They're not fighting for territory, though they'll happily claim worlds they conquer. They're not even fighting for survival, at least not in the traditional sense. Orks fight because they need to fight, because combat feeds the WH field that sustains their entire society, because the thrill of battle is literally what makes them feel alive. This means that an ideal fight, from an ork perspective, is one where the enemy puts up enough resistance to make things interesting, but not so much resistance that the orks can't win. They want violence, carnage, the thunder of guns, and the clash of close combat. They want to feel like they're in danger, while simultaneously feeling like they're winning. It's a delicate balance, And orcs have an instinctive sense for when a fight is going to provide that balance and when it isn't. When a fight goes well, when the orcs are winning but the enemy is still putting up a good scrap, the WH field grows stronger. Orcs become more enthusiastic, more aggressive, more willing to take risks and charge into danger. The psychic pressure builds and builds until it can become almost palpable, a tangible presence on the battlefield that humans describe as an oppressive weight, a feeling of being watched by something vast and malevolent. Weird boys. The orc psychers who channel WH energy can become so overwhelmed during these moments that their heads literally explode from the psychic pressure, vomiting forth devastating blasts of green lightning that annihilate everything nearby. But when a fight goes poorly, when the orcs are taking casualties without inflicting them in return, when the enemy proves to be too strong, or too numerous, or simply unkillable, the WH field begins to falter. The psychic feedback loop that normally drives orcs to greater aggression instead starts to work in reverse. Orcs begin to question whether this is actually a good fight. They start looking for the nearest exit, or at least for someone else to be fighting instead. The mob mentality that makes them so fearless when things are going well can work against them when the tide turns, as individual orcs look to their fellows for cues on how to react and see the same uncertainty reflected back at them. This is where the role of the warboss becomes critical. A strong warboss acts as an anchor for the WH field, a focal point that keeps the psychic energy concentrated and directed. His confidence becomes their confidence. His aggression drives their aggression. As long as the warboss is still in the fight, still bellowing orders and crushing enemies with his power claw, the boys will keep fighting because their boss is winning, and if the boss is winning, they must be winning too. But if the warboss falls, if he's killed or badly wounded or forced to withdraw, that anchor is suddenly gone. The WH field loses its focal point, and the concentrated psychic energy that was driving the orcs forward disperses like smoke in a strong wind. Individual orcs are suddenly left to make their own decisions about whether to keep fighting, and many of them decide that discretion is the better part of valor. They don't think of it as retreating or giving up in true orc fashion. They rationalize it as simply going somewhere else to find a better fight, somewhere they can come back for another go once they've regrouped and gathered more boys. It's important to understand that orcs do have a concept of tactical withdrawal, even though they don't think of it in those terms. The Blood Axes clan, in particular, has adopted many Imperial Guard tactics, including the strategic retreat, and while other orc clans mock them for this, orky behavior, even the most fanatical goth will withdraw from a fight that's going badly enough. They don't see this as losing, because in the orc worldview, a fight is only lost when you're dead and can't come back for another go. Running away just means you're taking a break, gathering your strength, finding more boys to bring to the next scrap. This is the key to understanding orc combat psychology. They're not mindless berserkers who fight literally anything until they die. They're aggressive, certainly, and their threshold for what constitutes an acceptable fight is far higher than most species could tolerate. But they do have limits. When a fight stops being fun, when it becomes clear that they're just dying without making any impact on the enemy, when the WH field falters and that magical psychic feedback that normally sustains them in combat disappears, orcs will disengage. They're also surprisingly capable of tactical thinking when the situation demands it. Warbosses don't get to be warbosses by being stupid. They have to be cunning, as well as brutal. Or maybe brutal as well as cunning, depending on whether they worship Gork or Mork. They can recognize when a fight is going to be profitable, and when it's going to be a waste of good boys. They can calculate, in their own crude way, whether the potential for a good scrap outweighs the likelihood of getting their entire mob wiped out for nothing. This brings us to the crucial question. What would make an orc warboss look at a potential fight and decide it's not worth having? What kind of enemy would fail to trigger the normal orc enthusiasm for combat? Would fail to feed the WH field in productive ways? would represent such an imbalance between effort and reward that even the most aggressive greenskin would find somewhere else to be? The answer, as we're about to explore, involves a unique combination of factors that Custodian Dreadnoughts embody. It's about the psychic disruption they cause to the Warhammer field. It's about the overwhelming power disparity they represent. It's about the cold mathematics of combat effectiveness. It's about ancient legends and primal instincts encoded in Ork genetic memory. And it's about the simple fact that fighting a Custodian Dreadnought doesn't provide what Orks need from combat: the thrill of a good scrap, the joy of violence, the satisfaction of crushing worthy enemies. Instead, fighting a Custodian Dreadnought means dying in droves while accomplishing nothing. Watching your boys get torn apart by weapons that never miss, charging into melee only to be crushed by a power fist the size of a transport vehicle. Seeing your best fighters and biggest knobs reduced to smears on the battlefield, while the Golden War machine strides forward completely unharmed. It means the WH! Field collapsing around you as the psychic pressure that normally sustains you in battle is disrupted by something old and powerful and fundamentally inimical to everything the greenskins represent. In short, it means a bad fight, the worst kind of fight, the kind that no amount of Ork optimism can reframe as a good time. And Orks, for all their love of violence, are smart enough to recognize when a fight isn't worth having. Legends written in blood, historical encounters, understanding why Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts requires examining the historical record of what happens when these forces do meet on the battlefield. The pattern that emerges from these encounters is so one-sided, so consistently devastating to the Ork forces, that it provides all the explanation needed for why greenskins have learned to give these Golden War machines a wide berth whenever possible. The most famous encounter between Custodians and Orks occurred during the Great Crusade at the Battle of Gyros, Thravian. This engagement has become legendary not just for its outcome, but for what it revealed about the true capabilities of the Emperor's bodyguards when deployed in force. The Ork warlord Garkle Blackfang had assembled one of the most powerful WAGHs encountered during the Crusade, a green tide so massive that it required 3 full Space Marine legions to engage it: the Lunar Wolves, Death Guard, and Imperial Fists, among the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. Despite deploying 3 entire legions, each numbering tens of thousands of Astartes, the Imperial forces found themselves pushed to the brink of defeat. Garkle's forces were simply too numerous, too aggressive, too well led by a war boss whose tactical cunning matched his physical might. The situation became so dire that the Primarchs themselves, Horus, Mortarion, and Rogel Dawn, were personally engaged in the fighting, leading their forces from the front in desperate attempts to stem the green tide. Yet still the Orks pressed forward, threatening to overwhelm the Imperial positions entirely. It was then that the Emperor intervened. Aboard his golden battle barge, the Bucephalus, he led a force of 1,000 Custodians in a direct assault on the heart of the Ork horde. Not 10,000, not even 5,000, just 1,000 of the 10,000. A relatively small force by the standards of the Great Crusade. The Emperor personally led them into battle, his golden armor blazing with psychic light as he struck directly at Garkle Blackfang's position. What followed can only be described as a massacre. The Custodians didn't just fight through the Ork forces, they annihilated them. Moving with perfect coordination despite their individualistic training, the Golden Warriors carved through the greenskin horde like a power blade through flesh. Their guardian spears and power swords never missed, every thrust finding a vital organ, every slash severing limbs or heads. They moved faster than the Orks could react, their superior reflexes and combat training allowing them to dance through the melee untouched while leaving devastation in their wake. The Emperor confronted Garkle Blackfang atop a towering gargant, a massive Ork war machine that served as both mobile fortress and symbol of the warlord's power. In a display of martial prowess that would be recounted for millennia afterward, the Master of Mankind decapitated the giant black-skinned Ork with a single strike from his flaming sword. As the warlord's head tumbled from the gargant to fall among the horde below, the Custodians laid waste to his elite bodyguards, the biggest and toughest orcs in the entire WAHH, cutting them down with methodical precision. The effect on the orc forces was immediate and catastrophic. With their warboss dead, the WAHH field that had sustained them collapsed like a punctured balloon. The psychic pressure that had driven them to ever greater acts of violence simply disappeared, leaving millions of orcs suddenly directionless and confused. Panic swept through their ranks as orcs looked around for leadership and found none, the chain of command shattered by the loss of Garkul and his inner circle. What followed was a slaughter. Within moments, legend claims, over 100,000 orcs died. The Custodians continued their advance through the now routed greenskin forces, killing with ruthless efficiency. The Space Marine legions, no longer pressed by the full weight of the WAHH, swept forward from their defensive positions to engage the fleeing orcs. The greenskins found themselves trapped between the anvil of the Custodian assault and the hammer of the Space Marine advance, with nowhere to run and no leadership to rally around. Those who tried to flee ran straight into the advancing legions. Those who tried to stand and fight were cut down by the Custodians. It was, by all accounts, one of the most complete victories achieved during the entire Great Crusade. The casualties tell the story. Of the 1,000 Custodians who entered the battle, only 3 fell. 3 warriors, out of 1,000, against an orc horde that numbered in the millions. The Emperor was so moved by their sacrifice that he personally engraved their names into his armor, an honor granted to no other warriors in the Imperium's history. That kill ratio, 1 Custodian for every 33,000 or more orcs, stands as testament to the sheer gulf in capability between the Emperor's personal guard and virtually any other force in the galaxy. This battle established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Imperial history. When Custodians engage orcs, the result is not simply victory but complete domination. The greenskins might outnumber the Golden Warriors 10 to 1, 100 to 1, even 1,000 to 1. But those numbers don't matter when each Custodian can kill dozens or hundreds of orcs before falling themselves, if they fall at all. During the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, the Adeptus Custodes once again faced orcs on a massive scale. The Beast's WNGH was the largest the galaxy had seen since the Ullanor Crusade, perhaps the largest in all of recorded history. The Beast orcs themselves were different from normal greenskins, larger, smarter, more organized, showing signs of the sophisticated Krork heritage that modern orcs had supposedly lost. Standard orc boys towered above normal greenskins, while the war bosses and warlords were the size of dreadnoughts, massive creatures that could challenge Space Marine captains in single combat and win. When the Custodians deployed against these enhanced orcs, the results were still decisively in the Emperor's favor. The Beast orcs were tougher, smarter, and better equipped than any orcs the Imperium had faced before or has faced since, but they still couldn't match the Custodian Guard in combat. The Golden Warriors adapted to fighting larger, more dangerous orcs with the same methodical precision they brought to every engagement. Where it might take a Custodian 3 or 4 seconds to kill a normal orc, it might take 6 or 7 to kill a Beast orc, but the outcome remained the same. The War of the Beast did teach the Imperium something crucial about orc psychology, however. During one engagement, the Death Watch and the Sisters of Silence worked together to capture an orc weirdboy. Using the psychic nullification effects of the Sisters, they created what they called a reverse WH, a psychic dead zone that disrupted the gestalt field the orcs relied upon. The effect on the greenskin forces was dramatic. Without the WH field to sustain them, to give them direction and purpose, the orcs became confused and disorganized. They didn't simply flee. They seemed to lose the will to fight entirely, stumbling around in a daze as if waking from a dream. This discovery was crucial because it revealed that the field wasn't just a beneficial boost to orc combat effectiveness. It was essential to their ability to function as a cohesive military force. Disrupt that field, and you don't just weaken the orcs, you fundamentally break them as a fighting force. And while the Sisters of Silence could create localized disruptions through their psychic null fields. There were other forces in the galaxy that could produce similar effects through different means. In more recent Imperial history, smaller, scale engagements between Custodians and Orks have continued to follow the same pattern. During the defense of the Imperial Palace against various incursions over the millennia, Ork war bands have occasionally penetrated the outer defenses and found themselves facing the 10,000. These encounters are uniformly brief and catastrophically one-sided. The Orks charge in with their usual enthusiasm, bellowing war cries and eager for a good scrap with the legendary Golden Warriors they've heard about in tales passed down through genetic memory. What they find instead is something their simple psychology isn't equipped to process. The Custodians don't just defeat them, they do so with an efficiency that borders on insulting. There's no back and forth struggle, no trading of blows, no moment where the Orks feel like they're giving as good as they're getting. The Custodians simply execute them, moving through the Ork ranks like harvesters through wheat, each movement precise and deadly, each strike claiming a life or crippling a combatant. The few Orks who survive these encounters carry with them a deep, instinctive understanding that the Golden Warriors are different from any other enemy they've faced. When Custodian Dreadnoughts enter these engagements, the psychological impact multiplies. The Orks see a target that should be ideal for them, a big, heavily armored war machine that they can mob and tear apart through sheer numbers. This is exactly the kind of fight that usually gets greenskins excited. The opportunity to bring down something massive and impressive, to prove their strength against a worthy foe. But as soon as they engage, they realize this isn't going to be like fighting an Imperial Knight or a Space Marine Dreadnought. The Custodian Dreadnought doesn't just fight back, it annihilates them. Its weapons never miss, firing with a precision that seems impossible for something so large. Its melee strikes crush multiple Orks with each blow, the power fist swinging through their ranks like they're not even there. Orks who manage to land hits on its armor find their weapons bouncing off the auramite plating without leaving so much as a scratch. The machine spirit seems to anticipate their movements, the ancient warrior inside processing the chaotic Ork assault with millennia of combat experience and responding with perfect economy of motion. Worst of all, from the Ork perspective, is the feeling that comes over them when they get close to these golden war machines. It's not fear in the way humans experience it. Orks don't really do fear in any conventional sense. It's more like a sudden clarity, a moment where the usual naboye gauge energy that drives them forward and makes them feel invincible simply isn't there anymore. They feel exposed, vulnerable in a way they normally don't, as if some essential support has been pulled away. The psychic presence of the Custodian Dreadnought, that spark of the Emperor's own essence that protects and empowers it, seems to create a dead zone in the WH field, a bubble of psychic silence that leaves Orks floundering. The pattern that emerges from all these encounters is clear and consistent. Custodians in general, and Custodian Dreadnoughts in particular, represent a level of threat that doesn't fit into the normal Ork understanding of combat. They're not just tough enemies who'll give the boys a good fight before going down. They're something else entirely. Something that the genetic memory encoded in every Ork recognizes as fundamentally dangerous in a way that transcends normal battlefield calculations. This historical record has been absorbed into the collective Ork consciousness through that same genetic memory. Modern Orks who've never seen a Custodian Dreadnought still carry within their DNA the accumulated experiences of all the Orks who came before them and learned, usually fatally, that these golden war machines are to be avoided. It's not a conscious knowledge, not something an Ork could articulate if you asked them about it. It's more like an instinct, a gut feeling that says this fight isn't worth having, that there are better scraps to be had elsewhere. The psychic disruption, why the Wahish, falters perhaps the most crucial factor in understanding why Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts lies in the psychic dynamics at play when these forces meet on the battlefield. The interaction between the field and the Emperor's blessing that surrounds his custodians creates a unique phenomenon that fundamentally undermines everything that makes Orks effective combatants. To understand this, we need to examine both sides of the psychic equation and how they interact. The WH40K field, as we've discussed, is essential to Ork combat effectiveness. It's not just a bonus, not just something that makes them a bit stronger or more enthusiastic. It's the foundation of their entire approach to warfare, the psychic scaffolding that supports their ramshackle technology, their mob tactics, their fearlessness in the face of overwhelming odds.
Without the WH
field, Orks are still dangerous, still large and strong, and naturally inclined toward violence, but they lose the edge that makes them such a terrifying threat to the Imperium. The field works because it's generated by the collective psychic emanations of all nearby Orks. Every greenskin is a low-level psyker, whether they know it or not, constantly broadcasting their aggression and confidence into the immaterium. When many Orks gather together, these individual broadcasts combine and reinforce each other, creating a gestalt field that's greater than the sum of its parts. This field feeds back into the Orks themselves, making them feel stronger, more confident, more invincible. It's a positive feedback loop that grows stronger with each Ork added to the mob, and with each victory they achieve in battle. But this field is also vulnerable to disruption. We've seen how the death of a warboss can cause it to collapse, how the Sisters of Silence can create psychic null zones that leave Orks confused and directionless. These vulnerabilities exist because the WH field, for all its power, is ultimately just organized psychic energy, a structure imposed on the raw stuff of the warp by the collective Ork will. Disrupt that structure and the field collapses, at least temporarily. Now consider what custodians represent from a psychic perspective. Each member of the 10,000 carries within them a spark of the Emperor's own divine essence, a fragment of the most powerful psyker humanity has ever produced. This isn't metaphor or religious belief. It's a measurable psychic phenomenon that manifests in several observable ways. Custodians are remarkably resistant to psychic attack, their minds shielded by what appears to be the Emperor's own protection. They're essentially immune to chaos corruption, the taint that can turn even space marines to the ruinous powers unable to find purchase in a custodian's soul. And they radiate what can only be described as holy light, a psychic presence that drives back the darkness of the warp. This last property is particularly relevant to our discussion. The Emperor's light that shines through custodians doesn't just protect them, it actively pushes against psychic phenomena in their vicinity. It's as if each custodian carries a small piece of the Emperor's own psychic might, creating an aura of order and sanctity that the warp finds difficult to penetrate. For humans, this manifests as an almost supernatural warding, bullets that should hit instead miss by inches, blades that should find flesh instead turn aside at the last moment, psychic powers that should overwhelm them instead flicker and fail. For Orks, the effect is more profound and more disturbing.
The WH
field they rely upon is fundamentally a warp-based phenomenon, a psychic structure built from the accumulated aggression and confidence of the greenskin species. When it encounters the Emperor's light radiating from a custodian, these two forces don't simply coexist, they conflict. The orderly, disciplined psychic presence of the Emperor's blessing pushes against the chaotic, instinctive energy of the WH field, creating a zone of psychic turbulence around the custodian. Individual custodians create localized disruptions in the WH field, bubbles of psychic interference that make Orks in their immediate vicinity feel uncertain and exposed. It's not enough to completely shut down the WH field across an entire battlefield. The greenskin gestalt is too powerful and too widespread for that. But it does mean that Orks fighting custodians don't receive the full benefit of the WH field. They feel weaker, less confident, more vulnerable than they do when fighting other enemies. When we scale this effect up to a custodian dreadnought, the disruption becomes much more significant. The warrior piloting the dreadnought is still a custodian, still carries that spark of the Emperor's essence. But now that essence is amplified, and focused through the Dreadnoughts systems. The machine itself has been blessed and sanctified in rituals performed by the highest, ranking members of the Ecclesiarchy and the Mechanicus. Its armor has been inscribed with protective wards that channel and enhance the Emperor's protection. The machine spirit inhabiting the Dreadnought is touched by the same divine essence that protects living custodians, creating a second layer of psychic presence. The result is a war machine that radiates the Emperor's light like a beacon, creating a much larger zone of psychic disruption around itself. Orks within this zone, roughly equivalent to the Dreadnought's immediate combat radius, find the Dummer field severely weakened or even entirely suppressed. They can't sense the psychic pressure from their fellow Orks that normally tells them they're winning. They can't feel the confidence boost that makes them eager to charge into combat. The technology they rely on, held together by psychic belief as much as physical construction, becomes noticeably less reliable, weapons jamming more frequently, vehicles sputtering and stalling. For weird boys, the Ork psychers who channel WH40K energy directly, the presence of a Custodian Dreadnought is actively painful. They're used to bathing in the raw psychic power generated by their fellow Orks, drinking it in and unleashing it as devastating attacks. But near a Custodian Dreadnought, that flow of energy becomes turbulent and chaotic. Instead of a smooth stream of power they can channel, they experience something more like drinking from a fire hose that's simultaneously being blocked by a dam. The psychic pressure builds up painfully in their heads, with nowhere to go, while simultaneously the power they're used to wielding becomes unreliable and difficult to control. Many weird boys will simply refuse to get close to Custodian Dreadnoughts, their survival instinct overriding even the compulsion
To support the WH40K!
This psychic disruption extends beyond just weakening Ork combat effectiveness. It fundamentally changes the nature of the fight from the Ork perspective. Remember that Orks need combat to be a certain way. They need it to be fun, exciting, a proper scrap that feeds the
WH
field and makes them feel alive. Fighting near a Custodian Dreadnought doesn't feel like that. It feels wrong, unnatural, like fighting with one hand tied behind your back while wearing a blindfold. The instinctive confidence that normally drives Orks forward is replaced by uncertainty. The joy of battle is replaced by a grinding sense that this fight isn't going well and isn't going to get better. The war boss, who normally acts as a focal point for the field and keeps it concentrated and directed, finds his role much more difficult near a Custodian Dreadnought. He can still project psychic authority, still be the biggest and strongest Ork in the mob, but that authority doesn't carry as far or as powerfully when it has to push through the Emperor's light. His ability to keep the boys fighting, to rally them when things get tough, to prevent the mob from breaking and running, all of this becomes significantly harder when the very psychic mechanisms he relies on are being disrupted. There's also evidence, though it remains largely anecdotal and unconfirmed, that the disruption goes even deeper. Some inquisitors who've studied Ork behavior extensively theorize that the Emperor's light doesn't just interfere with the WH40K field. It actually causes something like psychic feedback in the Ork nervous system. Orks who've fought against Custodians and survived, a rare breed admittedly, sometimes display behavior suggesting they found the experience deeply unpleasant in ways they can't articulate. It's not fear in the human sense, but more like a profound wrongness, as if some essential part of what makes them Orks was temporarily suppressed or denied. This theory aligns with what we know about how the Emperor's light affects other warp-based phenomena. Daemons can't maintain their physical forms in the presence of sufficiently powerful manifestations of the Emperor's blessing. Psychic powers falter and fail. Warp-based corruption withers and dies. If we accept that Ork psychology and technology are at least partially warp-based, relying on psychic mechanisms to function, then it makes sense that the Emperor's light would have a suppressive effect on them. The cumulative effect of all these factors creates a combat environment that's uniquely unfavorable for Orks. They're not just facing a physically superior enemy, they're fighting in conditions that actively suppress their advantages.
The Dowager!
Field that normally makes them fearless and confident is disrupted. The mob mentality that makes them effective through sheer numbers doesn't work as well when the psychic links between individual orcs are interfered with. The ramshackle technology they rely on becomes even less reliable than usual. Even the warboss's ability to keep them organized and fighting is compromised. And here's the crucial point: orcs can feel this happening. They're not sophisticated enough to understand the psychic mechanisms at work, but they can sense that something is wrong, that the usual joy of battle has been replaced by something much less pleasant.
They can feel my itch!
Field faltering around them, can sense their connection to the mob weakening, can recognize that they're not operating at full effectiveness. This awareness is what drives the orc response to Custodian Dreadnoughts. It's not that they're afraid, not in any conventional sense. It's that they recognize, on an instinctive level, that this fight isn't giving them what they need from combat.
It's not feeding the Milwagaga!
Field. It's not exciting or fun. It's not the kind of scrap that makes them feel alive. It's a bad fight, the kind that drains rather than sustains, that weakens rather than strengthens. And orcs, for all their love of violence, are smart enough to recognize when a fight isn't worth having.
When they feel the Muwajish!
Field starting to collapse around them. When they sense that psychic wrongness that comes from being too close to the Emperor's light, they make the practical decision to disengage and find better fights elsewhere. It's not cowardice, it's survival instinct combined with a pragmatic understanding of what makes a good scrap. And fighting a Custodian Dreadnought, they've learned through millennia of painful lessons, is decidedly not a good scrap. Insurmountable power, the combat reality, beyond the psychic dynamics at play. There's a simpler and more brutal reason why orcs avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts: the sheer, overwhelming physical superiority these war machines represent, even if we remove all consideration of WG, field disruption, and psychic interference. The basic combat mathematics of engaging a Custodian Dreadnought are so unfavorable for orcs that any warboss with even a basic understanding of tactics would choose to avoid the fight. Let's start with the most fundamental question: can orc weapons actually hurt a Custodian Dreadnought? The answer is technically yes, but the reality is far more complicated. The Oromite armor plating on a Custodian Dreadnought is among the finest protective material ever created by human hands. Each layer is hand-forged by master artificers, treated with sacred oils, blessed in rituals that take days or weeks to complete, and inscribed with protective wards that channel the Emperor's own blessing. The resulting armor is stronger than the ceramite used on Space Marine dreadnoughts, lighter despite its greater thickness, and resistant to damage in ways that go beyond mere physical properties. A standard orc shooter, the crude bolter, analog that most orc boys carry, firing at a Custodian Dreadnought will accomplish precisely nothing. The bullets, already barely adequate against Space Marine armor, will bounce off the Oromite plating like raindrops hitting stone. Even orc big shooters, heavy weapons that can threaten light vehicles and infantry in cover, struggle to do more than score the paint on Custodian armor. You would need sustained fire from multiple big shooters, all concentrating their fire on the same section of armor, for minutes at a time, to have even a chance of penetrating through to the vital systems beneath. Orc rockets, crude missile weapons that are actually relatively effective against Imperial armor, fare slightly better, but not by much. A direct hit from a rocket might crack the outer layer of Oromite plating, might damage some of the decorative elements, or knock loose one of the purity seals that adorn the Dreadnought's chassis, but penetrating through to actually damage the Dreadnought's internal systems. That would require multiple direct hits on the same location, a feat that's virtually impossible given the Custodian Dreadnought's mobility and the notoriously poor accuracy of orc weaponry. The truly heavy orc weapons, the cannons and zap guns and shock attack guns that can threaten even super heavy tanks, do have the potential to damage a Custodian Dreadnought. But these weapons have their own problems. They're rare for one thing, not every orc mob has access to them. They're slow to reload and aim. They're notoriously unreliable even by Ork standards, with a tendency to explode and kill their own crews as often as they hit the enemy. And most critically, they have to hit their target, which is challenging when that target is a Custodian Dreadnought that moves with startling speed and agility for something so large. Even if we assume that the Orks manage to land a hit with a heavy weapon, even if we give them the benefit of every doubt and assume their crude technology functions perfectly, they're still only dealing incremental damage to a war machine that's designed to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser vehicles. A Custodian Dreadnought can continue fighting with damage that would cripple or destroy a standard Imperial vehicle. Its redundant systems mean that losing one weapon doesn't prevent it from using others. Its advanced armor can take hit after hit without compromising the sarcophagus at its heart. And the Custodian piloting it has fought through worse injuries in their flesh and blood form. Pain and damage are merely tactical considerations to be managed, not impediments to continued combat. Close combat, you might think, would offer Orks a better chance. After all, this is where greenskins excel, in the brutal melee where their natural strength and ferocity can be brought to bear. Surely a mob of Ork boys, led by a powerful nob with a power claw, could swarm a Custodian Dreadnought and tear it apart through sheer weight of numbers. The reality is far grimmer for the Orks. A Custodian Dreadnought in melee combat is death incarnate. Its Dreadnought close combat weapon, whether it's a standard power fist or one of the more specialized variants, swings with enough force to reduce Orks to paste with each strike. We're not talking about individual kills. We're talking about multiple Orks being destroyed with each blow. The power field and sheer kinetic energy of the weapon turning greenskin bodies into clouds of gore and shattered bone. The speed of these strikes is equally devastating. Custodian Dreadnoughts don't lumber around the battlefield like many Imperial walkers. The precision servos and advanced actuators that drive their movements allow them to strike with a speed that seems impossible for something so large. An Ork charging toward the Dreadnought has perhaps a second, maybe two, to close the distance before the power fist descends. Those who survive the initial strike, and there are rarely many, find themselves facing a war machine that can deliver follow-up attacks faster than they can react. Power claws, the Orks' most effective melee weapons, do give them a theoretical chance of damaging a Custodian Dreadnought in close combat. A nob with a power claw has the strength and the weapon to potentially crack Oromite armor if he can land a solid hit. But landing that hit is the problem. The Custodian piloting the Dreadnought has centuries or millennia of combat experience, has fought against every enemy the galaxy can produce, and can read an opponent's movements with such precision that he often counterattacks before the Ork has even completed his swing. The result is that the Ork nob charges in, power claw raised for a devastating blow, and finds himself battered aside by the Dreadnought's close combat weapon before he can strike. Or he makes his attack, the power claw descending toward what seems like an opening in the Dreadnought's defenses, only for the war machine to shift at the last moment. The claw glancing off heavy armor, while the Dreadnought's return strike removes the nob's head from his shoulders. Even in the rare cases where a power claw does connect and does manage to damage the Custodian Dreadnought, it's usually a Pyrrhic victory at best, the nob trading his life for minor damage to a single armor plate. The Dreadnought's secondary weapons further complicate any Ork assault. The Contemptor, Achilles, has its Drade Spear, which it can use to impale charging Orks before they even reach melee range. The Contemptor, Galatus, has its twin, linked in furnace incinerators, bathing approaching enemies in promethium flame that turns Orks into living torches. Even the standard Venerable Contemptor often mounts a Storm Bolter or similar weapon on its chassis, allowing it to thin out charging mobs before they can close to melee range. Then there's the matter of what happens when a Custodian Dreadnought decides to charge the Orks rather than waiting for them to come to it. The impact alone can kill dozens of greenskins, the multi-ton war machine crashing into Ork lines like a golden avalanche, crushing bodies beneath its armored feet and sending others flying from the sheer force of impact. The Dreadnought doesn't slow down or get bogged down by the mob surrounding it. It continues moving, continues striking, its pilot using momentum and mass as weapons in their own right. Let's put some numbers to this to illustrate just how one-sided these engagements are. A mob of 30 Ork boys, a standard-sized unit in most WH40Ks, charges a Custodian Dreadnought. The Dreadnought opens fire with its assault cannon as they approach, each burst of fire killing 2 to 3 Orks, maybe 5 or 6 bursts, before they close to melee range. That's 10 to 18 Orks dead before the mob even reaches combat. The remaining Orks crash into the Dreadnought, chopper blades swinging, hoping to overwhelm it through sheer numbers. The Dreadnought responds with its close combat weapon, each strike killing 3 to 5 Orks, depending on how tightly packed they are. It can deliver multiple strikes per second, its combat protocols and the pilot's expertise allowing for a sustained rate of attack that seems impossible for something so large. Within the first few seconds of melee combat, another 10 or more Orks are dead, crushed by the power fist or cut down by the Dreadnought's other weapons. The remaining Orks, perhaps 5 or 6 out of the original 30, suddenly find themselves alone, facing a completely undamaged war machine that has barely slowed down from killing their comrades. At this point, if the mob has any sense of self-preservation, they'll attempt to disengage. But the Custodian Dreadnought doesn't let them go easily. It pursues, continuing to kill fleeing Orks, even as they try to retreat. By the time the survivors have managed to get clear, if any survive at all, the mob of 30 has been reduced to maybe 2 or 3 battered Orks who'll carry with them the memory of just how futile fighting these golden war machines truly is. Now scale this up. Multiply it by the number of Ork mobs that would be required to meaningfully threaten a Custodian Dreadnought. You're looking at hundreds of Orks dying to bring down a single war machine. And that's assuming everything goes right for the greenskins, assuming their weapons function perfectly, assuming they can land hits with their heavy weapons, assuming their melee specialists can actually close to combat and survive long enough to attack. The reality is often worse. In actual combat conditions, with the WH40K field disrupted by the Dreadnought's presence, with morale beginning to crack as the Orks watch their fellows die in droves, with the Custodian pilot using terrain and tactics to maximize his advantages, the number of Orks required to destroy a single Custodian Dreadnought could easily climb into the thousands. And those thousands would be dying for the chance to kill one enemy, one war machine out of what might be dozens or hundreds on the battlefield. From a purely tactical standpoint, this is an appalling exchange rate. A war boss has limited resources, even in the massive WAGS that can number millions of Orks. Every boy he loses to a futile assault on a Custodian Dreadnought is a boy who can't be used somewhere else, can't be charging into more favorable fights, can't be contributing to victories that would feed the WH field and attract more Orks to the mob. Throwing hundreds or thousands of Orks at a single Custodian Dreadnought isn't just inefficient, it's actively counterproductive.
It weakens the Moyaga
As a whole for minimal gain. This is the cold mathematics that underlies Ork behavior toward Custodian Dreadnoughts. Even if we remove all consideration of psychic disruption, even if we assume the WH field is functioning perfectly, and the Orks are at peak confidence and aggression, the simple reality of the combat effectiveness disparity makes engaging these war machines a losing proposition. Orks aren't stupid, and war bosses don't get to be war bosses by making tactical decisions that waste their forces for no gain. When they see a Custodian Dreadnought on the battlefield, they do the smart thing. They find somewhere else to fight, somewhere their boys can actually make a difference, somewhere the fight will be worthwhile rather than futile. Ancient terrors, millennia of war, there's another dimension to why Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts that goes beyond immediate combat effectiveness or psychic disruption. It's a dimension that has to do with age, with legend, with the accumulated weight of millennia spent perfecting the art of war. Custodian Dreadnoughts aren't just skilled warriors operating superior war machines. They're ancient beings who have been fighting since before the Imperium existed in its current form. And that antiquity carries implications that even Orks can sense on some instinctive level. Consider the timeline we're working with. The youngest Custodian Dreadnought, if such a term even makes sense, would have been interred sometime after the Horus heresy 10,000 years ago. More likely, they were entombed during, or even before that catastrophic civil war, meaning they've been fighting in their current form for 10 millennia or more. The oldest among them might date back to the Unification Wars, the conflicts that brought terror under the Emperor's rule before the Great Crusade even began. These are warriors who have been at war for longer than most civilizations have existed. Let that sink in for a moment. A Custodian Dreadnought pilot has potentially been fighting continuously for 10,000 years or more. That's not 10,000 years of training or studying warfare in theory. That's 10,000 years of actual combat experience, facing every enemy the galaxy can produce. Adapting to every new threat that's emerged across 100 centuries of endless war. The tactical database contained within their enhanced brains, already superior to baseline humans or even space marines, has been refined across literally thousands of campaigns. They've fought Orks of every clan and culture. They've faced the Tyrannid hive fleets as they arrived in the galaxy. They've battled Chaos Marines who were their brothers before the heresy, watching them devolve into the monsters they are today. They've engaged Necron Tomb worlds, Eldar craft worlds, TOE expansions, and threats so obscure they've been forgotten by everyone except those who fought them. Each of these encounters has taught them something, added another layer of experience to their already vast knowledge, refined their understanding of how to kill efficiently and effectively. The machine spirits inhabiting these ancient war machines share in this accumulated experience. Unlike the relatively simple machine spirits found in standard Imperial vehicles, which are barely sentient and operate mostly on programmed responses, the machine spirits of Custodian Dreadnoughts are old and powerful and possessed of something approaching true consciousness. They've bonded with their Custodian pilots over centuries or millennia of combat, learning from them, adapting to their fighting styles, developing a synergy that goes beyond mere mechanical response. Some priests theorize that these machine spirits have been touched by the same divine essence that protects living custodians. Though whether this happens through their connection to the pilot or through the countless blessing rituals performed on them over the centuries remains unclear. What is clear is that they're remarkably aggressive and willful, even by the standards of ancient Imperial war machines. They don't just obey commands from their pilots. They anticipate them, often responding to threats before the Custodian has even consciously registered them. They seem to seek out the most dangerous enemies on the battlefield, as if they hunger for worthy opponents to test themselves against. This combination of ancient warrior and ancient machine spirit creates something that transcends the normal boundaries of what's possible in warfare. The Custodian Dreadnought doesn't just react to enemies, it predicts them. It doesn't just counterattacks, it prevents them from being made in the first place. The level of tactical awareness and battlefield control that these war machines demonstrate seems almost supernatural, and in a sense, perhaps it is. When you have a warrior with 10,000 years of combat experience operating through a machine that's been blessed by the highest authorities of the Imperium and touched by the Emperor's own light, you've created something that exists at the intersection of martial excellence, advanced technology, and divine intervention. For Orks, whose genetic memory allows them to inherit the experiences of their ancestors, this antiquity carries special significance. Modern Orks have never seen the Unification Wars or the Great Crusade, but their DNA contains fragments of memory from Orks who did, who fought against the Emperor's forces as he united terror and then expanded across the galaxy. Those ancient Orks learned harsh lessons about the Golden Warriors who served at the Emperor's side. Lessons that were encoded into the genetic legacy passed down through countless generations of greenskins. When a modern Ork encounters a Custodian Dreadnought, There's a moment of recognition that goes beyond conscious thought. The instincts encoded in their DNA respond to something about these war machines. Some quality that marks them as threats of a particular kind. It's not fear, not exactly, but more like a deep, instinctive understanding that this is an enemy that has been killing orcs since before recorded history, that knows every trick in the greenskin playbook, that has seen everything orcs can throw at it and has learned how to counter it all. This manifests in subtle ways during combat. Orc war bosses, whose own combat experience and natural cunning make them the smartest and most dangerous greenskins in any WAGH, tend to recognize Custodian Dreadnoughts as immediate priority targets, not because they think they can kill them easily, but because they understand on some level that these war machines represent a threat that needs to be neutralized if the fight is going to go the Orcs' way. But that recognition often comes paired with a tactical calculation about whether the cost of engaging is worth the potential benefit. The legends that surround Custodian Dreadnoughts within Imperial culture also filter down through the Imperium's enemies, including Orks. The greenskins hear tales from captured humans, or read propaganda from defaced Imperial monuments, stories about the Golden Walkers who've never been defeated in battle, who've stood guard over the Emperor for 10,000 years, who crush armies beneath their armored feet. While Orks don't put much stock in human stories, these tales do add to the accumulated weight of evidence suggesting that fighting Custodian Dreadnoughts is a bad idea. There's also the matter of personal history for the Dreadnought pilots themselves. These aren't anonymous warriors operating faceless war machines. Many of them have names and reputations that span millennia. They've fought in campaigns that are recorded in the highest annals of the Imperium, stood beside Primarchs and the Emperor himself, witnessed events that have shaped the galaxy. Some of them have killed tens of thousands of enemies over their long service, each death adding to a tally that would be incomprehensible to mortals. When such a being strides onto the battlefield, there's a weight of history that comes with them. The very ground seems to remember the countless times these war machines have walked similar battlefields, dealing death to the Emperor's enemies. The air feels heavier, charged with the psychic residue of 10,000 years of war. Even the sky seems to darken slightly, as if reality itself recognizes that something ancient and terrible has arrived. Something that has seen civilizations rise and fall, that has outlasted empires and species. For Orks who live in the moment and rarely think about the distant past or future, this antiquity is alien and unsettling. They're a young species in many ways, each individual Ork growing to maturity quickly, living for a few decades at most before dying in battle, or through the internal conflicts that characterize Ork society. The idea of something that's been fighting for 10,000 years, that's older than the eldest Ork who ever lived by orders of magnitude, doesn't fit into their worldview. It's too big, too incomprehensible, too far removed from the immediate, visceral reality they understand. This incomprehensibility adds to the general sense of wrongness that Orks feel when confronting Custodian Dreadnoughts. These aren't just tough enemies or big war machines. They're ancient things that shouldn't exist, relics from an age when the galaxy was fundamentally different, beings who've seen and done things that no Ork could imagine. The gulf of experience between even the most veteran Ork warbos and the youngest Custodian Dreadnought is so vast that it might as well be infinite. And that experience shows in every aspect of how Custodian Dreadnoughts fight. They don't make mistakes, not in any meaningful sense. They don't fall for feints or tricks that have been tried against them countless times before. They don't waste movement or ammunition or energy on anything that won't contribute to victory. Every action is economical, precise, the product of millennia of refinement. Fighting them isn't like fighting a normal enemy, where you might get lucky, might catch them off guard, might exploit a moment of weakness. It's like fighting something that's already seen every move you might make and has prepared counters for all of them centuries ago. This perfection of martial excellence is its own form of psychological warfare. Orks who engage Custodian Dreadnoughts quickly realize they're not having a proper scrap. They're being executed with clinical precision by something that's been perfecting the art of killing greenskins since before their species even existed in its current form. That realization, combined with all the other factors we've discussed, the psychic disruption, the overwhelming power disparity, the accumulated legend and history, creates a perfect storm of reasons to disengage and find better fights elsewhere. The survival instinct, orc tactical withdrawal. There's a common misconception about orcs that they're mindless brutes who'll fight anything, anywhere, without any sense of self-preservation or tactical awareness. This stereotype, while containing elements of truth, fundamentally misunderstands how greenskins approach warfare and survival. The reality is that orcs do have a survival instinct. They just express it in ways that are distinctly orky, and which can seem counterintuitive to those unfamiliar with their psychology. When an orc withdraws from combat, he doesn't think of it as retreating or admitting defeat. In the orc worldview, a fight is only truly lost when you're dead and unable to come back for another go. Everything else is just a tactical pause, a chance to regroup, gather more boys, and come back later for a proper scrap. This rationalization isn't just self-delusion. It's a fundamental part of how orcs process the world. They genuinely don't see withdrawal as a loss because they fully intend to return and finish the fight, just under better circumstances. This attitude is encoded in the orc language itself. There's no direct translation for retreat in orc speech. At least not one that carries the connotations of cowardice or defeat that it would in Gothic or other human languages. The closest equivalent translates to something like going somewhere else to find more gits to crump, which captures the orc perspective perfectly. They're not running away from the fight. They're going to find a better fight, one where they can actually win and have fun doing it. The Blood Axes clan has developed this concept into an actual tactical doctrine. Blood Axes are unusual among orcs in that they've adopted many tactics from the Imperial Guard, including camouflage, fortifications, and yes, strategic withdrawal. Other orc clans mock them mercilessly for this orky behavior, calling them cowardly and treacherous. But the Blood Axes understand something that their critics often miss: withdrawing from a bad fight and coming back later with more forces is actually the smart play. The cunning move that lets you win in the long run. A Blood Axes warboss facing a Custodian Dreadnought won't hesitate to pull his boys back and engage elsewhere. He'll rationalize this as proper tactics, as being cunning rather than just brutal. He'll plan to come back later, maybe with heavier weapons, maybe with more boys, maybe with a different approach entirely. The fact that later might never come, that he might conveniently find other enemies to fight and never quite get around to tackling that Custodian Dreadnought again, is beside the point. In his mind, he hasn't lost because he's still alive and still has an army. The fight can always be finished another time. But this pragmatic approach isn't limited to the Blood Axes. Even the most aggressive orc clans understand, on some level, the difference between a good fight and a bad one. Goths might love close combat more than any other form of warfare, but even they can recognize when a melee engagement is going to result in their entire mob being wiped out for nothing. Bad Moons might love showing off their expensive guns and fancy war gear, but they're not going to waste that equipment attacking an enemy they can't hurt. Evil Sons might love speed and aggressive assaults, but they're smart enough to drive their vehicles away from a fight that's going wrong.
The key factor is the number H!
Field and how it's functioning. When the WH40K is strong, when the psychic feedback loop is working properly and making every orc feel invincible, they'll fight against overwhelming odds without hesitation. The WH field makes them believe they can win, makes them eager to test themselves against any enemy, makes dying in combat seem like a good time rather than something to be avoided. But when that field starts to falter, when the psychic support structure begins to collapse, orcs suddenly become much more interested in survival. This is exactly what happens when orcs encounter Custodian Dreadnoughts.
The mummy ager!
Field disruption caused by the Emperor's light surrounding these war machines means that orcs don't receive the normal psychic boost that makes them fearless. Instead, they're operating closer to baseline greenskin psychology, which, while still aggressive and violent by human standards, does include a basic drive for self-preservation.
Without the WH!
Field telling them they're winning, they can see much more clearly that they're actually dying in droves without accomplishing anything. The decision to withdraw from such an engagement is often made by the mob itself, rather than being ordered by leadership. Individual orcs start to peel away from the fight, finding important business elsewhere on the battlefield, urgent tasks that need their attention, other enemies that definitely need crumping more than this particular golden war machine. These individual decisions aggregate into a general withdrawal as more and more orcs decide that this fight isn't worth their time. By the time the warboss realizes what's happening, he's often left with only his most loyal retainers, his personal guard who can't abandon him without losing their status in the hierarchy. At this point, the warboss himself has to make a choice. He can stand and fight, maintaining his reputation as the biggest and toughest orc in the mob, but likely dying in the process along with his best fighters. Or he can withdraw with his remaining forces, preserving his power base and living to fight another day. Most warbosses, being the cunning brutes they are, choose survival. They'll bellow orders about important objectives that need securing, about tactical repositioning, about regrouping for a proper assault, all while getting themselves and their retinue away from the Custodian Dreadnought as quickly as possible. This withdrawal is often remarkably organized by orc standards. The mob doesn't panic and run in all directions. They move with purpose toward other objectives on the battlefield, toward enemies they can actually fight effectively, toward opportunities for looting or mayhem that don't involve golden war machines of doom. The warboss maintains control throughout, using the withdrawal as a way to demonstrate his tactical acumen rather than admitting defeat. We'll come back for that one later, boys, once we've crumped these other gits and got ourselves proper ready. From the Custodian's perspective, this withdrawal can seem almost miraculous. One moment they're surrounded by hundreds of orcs, fighting off wave after wave of greenskins who seem determined to drown them in bodies. The next moment, the orcs are simply leaving, moving away toward other parts of the battlefield with almost orderly precision. The Custodian might pursue, killing retreating orcs as they go, but often they'll have other objectives that take priority over hunting down fleeing enemies. The important thing is that the orc assault has been broken, the threat neutralized, the fight won. This pattern has repeated itself so many times over the millennia that it's become almost predictable. Custodian Dreadnoughts can count on orcs disengaging after suffering a certain level of casualties. After the WH field has been disrupted for long enough, after it becomes clear to even the most stubborn greenskins that this particular fight isn't going well. It's not a formal rule, not something that's written down in any tactical manual, but it's a behavioral pattern that's been observed and documented in countless after-action reports. The long-term implications of this behavior are significant. Orc genetic memory absorbs these lessons, encoding the knowledge that engaging Custodian Dreadnoughts leads to bad outcomes. Each generation of orcs that withdraws from such fights passes that experience down to the next generation through their spores. Over time, over thousands of years and countless iterations, this has created an instinctive aversion to fighting these particular enemies. Modern orcs inherit this aversion without consciously understanding it. It's just something that feels wrong about fighting golden war machines. Something that suggests finding other targets would be smarter. This isn't cowardice. It's evolutionary pressure selecting for orcs who are smart enough to avoid fights they can't win. The orcs who charge headlong at Custodian Dreadnoughts without any tactical sense, who ignore the warning signs and keep fighting until they're all dead. They don't pass their genetic material forward because they don't survive to sporulate. The orcs who withdraw, regroup, and fight another day, they're the ones who pass their genetics forward, who spread their spores across conquered worlds, who ensure their clan's survival. over millennia. This selection pressure has created orc populations that instinctively understand when withdrawal is the smart choice. Warboss decision-making, while the rank and file orcs might make their tactical decisions based largely on instinct and the strength of the
Bloaga
field. War bosses operate on a somewhat different level. They're not just bigger and stronger than other orcs, they're also generally smarter, more cunning, more capable of genuine tactical thought. Understanding how warbosses make decisions about engaging or avoiding Custodian dreadnoughts gives us crucial insight into why this pattern of avoidance has become so consistent across different clans. Different WHs, different time periods. A warboss doesn't achieve his position through raw strength alone, though that's certainly important. He gets there by being better at violence than his rivals. Yes, but also by being smart enough to win fights and keep winning them,
to grow his WH
rather than squandering it on pointless battles. Every decision a warboss makes is filtered through a simple calculation like, will this make me bigger and stronger? Or will it make me smaller and weaker? The orcs who can consistently choose the former over the latter are the ones who become warbosses, and eventually, if they're successful enough, warlords commanding WHs that span star systems. When a warboss spots a Custodian dreadnought on the battlefield, several factors immediately go into his decision-making process. First, he assesses the potential reward. Killing a Custodian dreadnought would be a major achievement, a feat that would enhance his reputation considerably. The golden armor alone would be valuable loot, something he could wear or mount on his war banner to show off his prowess. The victory would feed the WH field, making his boys more enthusiastic and attracting more orcs to his banner. It's the kind of kill that makes legends, that gets talked about around campfires and spawning pits for generations. But then he assesses the cost. How many boys is he going to lose killing this thing? Hundreds, thousands. Even if he succeeds, even if he manages to bring down the Custodian dreadnought, is the cost worth it? Those boys he'd lose could be used elsewhere on the battlefield, fighting enemies they can actually beat without taking catastrophic casualties.
The Doige
Field that would be strengthened by victory would also be weakened by the massive losses required to achieve that victory. And there's no guarantee of success. If the fight goes badly, he might lose those boys and fail to kill the dreadnought anyway. Then there's the question of opportunity cost. While his forces are tied up fighting the Custodian dreadnought, what else could they be doing? Maybe there's a poorly defended Imperial position they could overrun, gaining loot and territory. Maybe there are enemy vehicles they could destroy, war machines they could capture and repurpose for their own use. Maybe there's a different enemy formation they could smash, one that would feed the
WH
field more effectively because the fight would be more balanced, more fun, more of a proper scrap rather than a grinding slaughter. Smart warbosses also consider the psychological impact on their forces. If they order an assault on a Custodian dreadnought and it goes badly, if the boys get slaughtered and the WH field collapses, that failure will undermine confidence in his leadership. Other knobs might start thinking they could do better, might start challenging him for control of the Orc society is brutally meritocratic. The boss is only the boss as long as he keeps winning and keeps being the biggest. A failed assault that gets a lot of boys killed for nothing is exactly the kind of thing that could inspire a challenge to his authority. On the other hand, if he strategically withdraws from fighting the Custodian dreadnought and directs his forces toward more favorable engagements, he can frame that as smart tactics rather than cowardice. We'll hit him where they're weak, not where they're strong. That's cunning. That is. The other orcs might grumble about missing out on a fight with the Golden War machine, but if the alternative targets provide good scraps with better outcomes, they'll be satisfied. And the warboss maintains his reputation as a leader who knows how to win. There's also an element of preserving the Mueg momentum.
A warrior age
Grows through success, through victories that attract more orcs and feed the psychic field that sustains the entire enterprise. Every significant victory
makes the Naboiga
stronger, drawing more greenskins to the banner, increasing the psychic pressure that makes individual orcs feel invincible. But losses have the opposite effect.
They weaken the Maoga!
Make it less attractive to potential recruits. Reduce the psychic field's strength. A warboss has to balance the immediate tactical situation against the long-term
health of his warg!
Losing a few hundred boys, while crushing an Imperial Guard regiment might be an acceptable trade, because the victory will attract replacements, and then some. But losing thousands of boys in a failed assault on a Custodian Dreadnought would weaken the WH in ways that might take years to recover from, if it recovers at all. The smart move is to avoid fights that drain the WH strength without providing commensurate benefits. Different warbosses handle this calculation differently based on their clan affiliations and personal characteristics. A Goth warboss, obsessed with close combat and personal glory, might be more tempted to fight a Custodian Dreadnought, because the challenge appeals to his sense of honor and his desire to prove himself against the toughest opponents. But even a Goth has to be smart enough to recognize when a fight is unwinnable. He might posture and threaten, might make a show of preparing for assault, but when it comes down to actually committing his forces, he'll often find reasons to attack other targets instead. A Blood Axe's warboss, already predisposed toward tactical withdrawal as a legitimate tool, would have no hesitation about avoiding a Custodian Dreadnought. He'd see it immediately as a poor tactical matchup, an enemy that doesn't play to his strengths, a fight that's all risk with minimal reward. He'd redirect his forces without a second thought, probably while mocking other clans for being too stupid to recognize when not to fight. A Bad Moon's warboss, rich in teeth and resources, might consider throwing his wealth at the problem, hiring mercenaries, or bringing in heavy weapons to even the odds. But he'd also be keenly aware that his wealth is what makes him powerful, that spending it on a single fight, even a difficult one, might not be the best use of resources. Better to use those resources on fights that will generate more wealth through looting, that will enhance his reputation in ways that attract more followers and more tribute. The crucial point is that all of these warbosses, regardless of clan or personal inclination, are making genuine tactical decisions based on an assessment of costs and benefits. They're not blindly charging into every fight, because that's what orcs do. They're choosing their battles, directing their forces toward objectives that will strengthen their position, avoiding conflicts that will weaken it. And consistently, across clans and time periods and different warbosses, the decision has been that fighting Custodian Dreadnoughts falls into that latter category. This consistent pattern of avoidance has become almost traditional in some Orc WH's older, more experienced warbosses will sometimes warn younger ones about the golden war machines, about how they're not worth fighting, about how there are always better targets available. This knowledge gets passed down, not through formal training or written records, because orcs don't really do those things, but through the oral tradition of bragging and storytelling that characterizes greenskin culture. I saw one of dem gold walking things once. Didn't bother with it. Plenty of other gits to crump. The end result is a battlefield behavior that's remarkably consistent. When Custodian Dreadnoughts deploy, orc forces flow around them like water around a stone, engaging other targets, finding other objectives, generally being elsewhere. The warboss might make aggressive noises, might posture about how he's going to crump that golden git later, but later has a way of never quite arriving. There's always something else that needs fighting more urgently. Always another target that's more worth the effort. When they do fight, rare exceptions, while the pattern of orc avoidance toward Custodian Dreadnoughts is strong and consistent, it's not absolute. There are situations where orcs do engage these war machines, where the usual calculations that lead to withdrawal don't apply or are overridden by other factors. Examining these exceptions helps us understand both the rule itself and the specific circumstances that can break it. The most common exception occurs when orcs simply have no choice but to fight. If a Custodian Dreadnought is blocking the only route to an objective the orcs absolutely must take, if it's guarding a position they need to capture, if there's literally no way to accomplish their goals without going through it, then even the most cautious war boss will order an assault. In these situations, the calculus changes. It's not about whether fighting is a good idea. It's about whether not fighting means automatic defeat. During the siege of the Eternity Gate spaceport on Terra, for example, Chaos cultists who had seized control of the port found themselves facing a counterattack led by land raiders and venerable contemptor, Dreadnoughts of the Custodian Guard. The cultists, many of whom had been corrupted by Chaos and no longer thought like normal humans, couldn't retreat because the spaceport was their only foothold on Terra. They had to fight, even knowing they would lose, because surrender or withdrawal meant abandoning their dark gods and facing execution anyway. Similar logic sometimes applies to Orks when they're trapped, or when retreat would mean certain death from other threats. Another exception occurs during the largest WH40Ks, when Ork numbers reach truly staggering levels. During the War of the Beast, the Ork forces were so numerous and so well organized that they could afford to throw massive resources at individual targets, even very difficult ones. When you have millions of Orks available and your WH40K is generating new warriors faster than they can be killed, the normal resource constraints that make fighting Custodian Dreadnoughts unattractive become less relevant. You can afford to lose thousands of boys killing a single war machine because you have thousands more ready to take their place. The Beast Orks themselves, being larger, smarter, and more sophisticated than normal greenskins, also seemed less inclined to avoid difficult fights. They had a level of tactical sophistication and strategic thinking that modern Orks lack, remnants of the Krork heritage that had largely been lost. They could coordinate complex assaults, employ combined arms tactics, and sustain operations despite taking heavy casualties. When Beast Orks encountered Custodian Dreadnoughts, they often committed to the fight with a determination and strategic focus that smaller WH40Ks couldn't match. Even then, the outcomes were rarely favorable for the Orks. The Custodian Dreadnoughts that fought during the War of the Beast tallied massive kill counts, sometimes destroying hundreds of Beast Orks before they were finally brought down through sheer weight of numbers. The exchange ratios remained heavily in favor of the Custodians, and the resources required to kill these war machines could have been used to greater effect elsewhere.
But the beast's WH
was so vast that it could absorb these losses and continue functioning, something that smaller WH simply cannot do. Occasionally, an individual Ork warboss will decide to fight a Custodian Dreadnought for personal rather than tactical reasons. This usually happens when the warboss has achieved a level of success and confidence that borders on arrogance. When he's won so many battles that he starts to believe he's genuinely invincible. Such a warboss might see the Custodian Dreadnought as the ultimate challenge, the final test that will prove his superiority once and for all. He'll order the assault not because it makes tactical sense, but because his ego demands it. These encounters almost invariably end badly for the warboss. No matter how big, how strong, how skilled he is, no matter how many battles he's won, or how feared his name might be, he's still an Ork facing a war machine, piloted by a warrior who's been fighting since before his ancestors were spores. The fight might last longer than it would against normal Ork forces, the warboss's personal combat skills and superior wargear, allowing him to survive for minutes instead of seconds. But the outcome is rarely in doubt. The Custodian Dreadnought will eventually land the killing blow, and the warboss will discover too late that some fights truly cannot be won through determination and strength alone. The death of such a warboss often triggers a complete collapse of his WH. Without their leader, without the anchor point that was holding the psychic field together, the Orks rapidly devolve into infighting and fragmentation. The various nobs and aspiring warbosses start competing for control, the unified force breaks into rival factions, and the threat level drops dramatically. This pattern has been observed so consistently that some Imperial strategists have actually used it as a tactic, identifying overconfident warbosses and maneuvering Custodian Dreadnoughts into position to duel them. knowing that the warboss's pride will lead him to accept the challenge, and that his death will shatter the WH more effectively than any conventional military victory. There are also rare cases where the psychic disruption effect doesn't work as expected. During some engagements, particularly those involving absolutely massive concentrations of orcs, the WH field can become so powerful and so concentrated that even the Emperor's light radiating from a Custodian Dreadnought isn't enough to suppress it entirely. The field might be weakened in the Dreadnought's immediate vicinity, but it remains strong enough overall to sustain Orc morale and aggression. In these situations, Orcs will sometimes fight with their usual enthusiasm, the psychic boost from the WH field overcoming the disruption effect. However, even in these cases, the physical reality of the combat effectiveness disparity remains. The Orcs might be willing to fight, might be enthusiastic about it even, but they're still dying in droves, while accomplishing relatively little. The Custodian Dreadnought continues to cut through their ranks with mechanical precision, and eventually the casualties mount high enough that even the most powerful WH field can't prevent morale from cracking. The Orcs might last longer in the fight than they normally would, but the ultimate outcome remains much the same. Sometimes environmental factors force engagement. In dense urban terrain, in underground tunnel systems, in the cramped corridors of space hulks, it's much harder to maneuver around a Custodian Dreadnought. The war machine might be blocking a critical passage, controlling a choke point that must be cleared for the Orcs to advance. In these situations, the normal option of simply avoiding the Golden Walker isn't available. The Orcs have to fight, or they have to abandon their objectives entirely. These close quarters engagements are, if anything, even more one-sided than open battlefield fights. The Custodian Dreadnought's superior close combat capabilities become even more dominant in confined spaces where the Orcs can't use their numbers as effectively. The war machine can hold a corridor against waves of greenskins almost indefinitely, its weapons creating walls of death that no amount of Orc determination can overcome. Even if the Orcs eventually bring it down through sheer persistence and weight of numbers, the casualties they suffer in the process are often sufficient to cripple their overall offensive. What all these exceptions have in common is that they're situations where the normal calculations that lead to avoidance don't apply. Either the Orcs have no choice, or they have resources so vast that the normal cost-benefit analysis changes, or individual factors like pride or environmental constraints override tactical common sense. And even in these cases, even when Orcs do commit to fighting Custodian Dreadnoughts, the results are consistently terrible for the greenskins. The lessons from these exceptions reinforce, rather than contradict, the general pattern. Orcs who fight Custodian Dreadnoughts suffer catastrophic casualties and achieve minimal results. The few cases where they succeed in destroying the war machines require such massive resource expenditure that the victory is hardly worth the cost. And the genetic memory of these engagements filters down through Orc generations, adding more weight to the instinctive understanding that these Golden Walkers are enemies to be avoided rather than engaged. Conclusion: the unspoken truth. We've journeyed through every aspect of why Orcs, the most combat-obsessed species in the galaxy, systematically avoid engaging with Custodian Dreadnoughts. We've examined the nature of the Adeptus Custodes themselves, the Emperor's finest warriors enhanced to the pinnacle of human potential. We've explored what Custodian Dreadnoughts are and the devastating capabilities they bring to the battlefield. We've delved into Orc psychology and the WH field that sustains their entire approach to warfare. We've reviewed the historical record of these encounters and the pattern of overwhelming Custodian victories. We've analyzed the psychic disruption that occurs when the Emperor's light meets greenskin fury. We've broken down the brutal mathematics of combat effectiveness and the impossible exchange ratios that would be required to bring these war machines down. We've considered the weight of millennia and legend that surrounds these ancient warriors. And we've examined both the pragmatic survival instincts that drive Orc tactical withdrawal and the rare exceptions where they do commit to fighting. What emerges from this comprehensive examination is a picture of a phenomenon that makes perfect sense once you understand all the factors involved. Orks aren't avoiding Custodian dreadnoughts because they're cowardly or because they've suddenly developed sophisticated tactical doctrines foreign to their nature. They're avoiding them because every factor that normally makes Orks effective combatants, their numbers, their enthusiasm, their psychic field, their mob mentality, is either neutralized or turned against them in these engagements.
The WH
field that should make them fearless instead falters under the Emperor's light. The numerical superiority that usually overwhelms enemies becomes meaningless against a war machine that can kill hundreds of them without taking meaningful damage. The joy of battle that sustains them in combat is replaced by the grinding horror of watching their fellows die in droves while accomplishing nothing. The genetic memory that guides their instinctive decisions tells them these golden walkers are threats of a particular kind. Enemies that have been killing Orks since before recorded history and have learned every trick in the Greenskin playbook. From the Ork perspective, engaging a Custodian dreadnought violates the fundamental principle that makes their entire species work. Fighting should be fun.
It should feed the mob gitch.
Field, strengthen the mob, make you feel alive and invincible. Fighting a Custodian dreadnought does none of these things.
It drains the WH,
weakens the mob, and makes even the most optimistic Ork feel mortal and vulnerable. It's not a good fight. It's not a proper scrap. It's not worth the time and effort and boys that would be required to see it through. And here's the crucial insight. Orks recognizing this and withdrawing from such fights is actually a sign of their intelligence, not their cowardice. It demonstrates that underneath the bluster and the enthusiasm for violence, greenskins are capable of genuine tactical thinking. They can assess threats, calculate odds, make strategic decisions about resource allocation. They can recognize when a fight is going to cost more than it's worth, when the potential rewards don't justify the certain losses, when discretion truly is the better part of valor. This capacity for tactical withdrawal, this ability to recognize bad matchups and avoid them, is part of why Orks have been so successful as a species. If they really did fight everything without any sense of self-preservation, if they never withdrew from losing battles or avoided unfavorable engagements, they would have been wiped out long ago. The fact that they can make these decisions, can choose to fight enemies they can beat rather than enemies they can't, is what's allowed them to spread across the galaxy and become one of the most numerous and threatening species in existence. The pattern of avoiding Custodian dreadnoughts is just one expression of this broader strategic intelligence. It's encoded in their genetic memory, reinforced by millennia of painful lessons, supported by instincts that tell them when a fight is worth having and when it isn't. Modern Orks inherit this understanding without necessarily knowing where it comes from. They just know, on a level deeper than conscious thought, that the golden war machines are different, that they're not the kind of enemy you charge headlong at with enthusiastic abandon. From the Imperial perspective, this behavior is actually somewhat problematic. The Adeptus Custodes would prefer that Orks did charge recklessly at their dreadnoughts, because that would allow the Golden Warriors to kill massive numbers of greenskins efficiently. The fact that Orks have learned to avoid these engagements means that Custodian dreadnoughts, for all their devastating capabilities, have less impact on overall Ork numbers than they otherwise might. The greenskins simply flow around them, finding other targets, accomplishing their objectives through other means. But from a broader strategic perspective, this Ork behavior does tell us something important about the power of the Adeptus Custodes and the awe they inspire even in the galaxy's most violent species. When warriors who love fighting more than life itself choose to avoid combat with you. When enemies who'll charge at titans and greater daemons with wild enthusiasm decide that you're not worth the trouble. That says something profound about the level of threat you represent. The Custodian dreadnoughts are more than just powerful war machines. They're symbols of the Emperor's enduring power, proof that even 10,000 years after his entombment, his will still shapes the galaxy. They're walking testaments to human achievement at its absolute pinnacle, demonstrations of what's possible when the finest warriors, the best technology, and divine blessing come together in service of a single purpose. They're legends made real. Ancient beings who've witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and who continue to serve with the same dedication they showed when the Imperium was young. And Orks, for all their love of a good fight, are smart enough to recognize when they're facing something beyond the normal parameters of warfare. They're intelligent enough to understand that some enemies aren't worth fighting, that some battles can't be won, that some machines of war are best left alone. This understanding, this capacity for strategic withdrawal in the face of overwhelming threat, is ultimately what makes them dangerous. An enemy who never retreats is predictable and can be countered. An enemy who recognizes when to disengage and find better fights is much more challenging to defeat decisively. The unspoken truth, then, is this: Orks avoiding Custodian Dreadnoughts is a sign of respect, in the only way Orks know how to show it. It's an acknowledgement that these golden walkers have earned their fearsome reputation through 10,000 years of unbroken martial excellence. It's a concession, however grudging and instinctive, that some enemies truly are beyond the reach of normal greenskin tactics. And it's a demonstration that even in the grim darkness of the 41st Millennium, where there is only war, there are still some fights that even the most battle-hungry species in the galaxy has learned to avoid. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's most fascinating battlefield phenomena, please like and subscribe to Stories of Hammer. We bring you comprehensive explorations of the lore, tactics, and mysteries of the 41st Millennium, always seeking to understand not just what happens in this dark future, but why it happens and what it means. Until next time, remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even warriors know when to choose their battles wisely.